The sky over northern France in the summer of 1944 was a sky of fire. The Luftwaffe was no longer the terror it had been in the early years of the war. Allied air power ruled with overwhelming numbers, and every German pilot knew that each mission was less a flight and more a gamble. Some still clung to pride, calling themselves Knights of the Air, heirs of the Great War's dueling aces. But pride did not stop American squadrons, armed with Mustangs, Thunderbolts and Spitfires, from shredding their formations to ribbons. Kurt Weber, 23, had flown 47 sorties. His Messerschmitt 109 was as familiar to him as his own bones. He could sense the stress of its frame through his hands, hear the strain in its engine like another man might hear his heartbeat. Yet even Kurt knew his skill mattered less each day. The sky belonged to the Allies now. He flew not for victory, but for survival. On this morning, he and his squadron had taken off from an airfield scarred with bomb craters, patched hastily with planks and gravel. Fuel was low, ammunition rationed. Their mission: intercept a wave of American bombers thundering toward the interior. As Kurt climbed into formation, sunlight glinted off the domes of countless flying fortresses above the clouds. The sight made his stomach twist. There were too many, always too many. Radio chatter crackled in his ears. A younger pilot, barely 19, muttered a prayer. Another cursed the high command for sending them up like lambs to slaughter. Kurt gritted his teeth. He had no words left for prayers or curses. He only had the stick in his hand, the throttle under his palm, and the instinct to fight until something, flak, fire, or fate, tore him down. It happened fast. American fighters swept down like hawks, their guns spitting fire. The sky erupted. Kurt banked hard, tracer rounds slicing the air behind him. A shell burst beneath his wing, shuddering the Messerschmitt with a deafening crack. Smoke poured from the engine, the propeller stuttered. He pulled desperately at the stick, the plane groaning as if in pain. His wingman disappeared in a bloom of fire. A scream crackled over the radio, cut short. Kurt's vision blurred with oil sprayed across the canopy. Another burst rocked the fuselage. His heart hammered. "Springen!" the order barked through his headset. "Jump!" Kurt yanked the canopy release. The wind tore at him, nearly dragging him out before he was ready. He pulled the parachute cord. The canopy blossomed above, jerking him skyward as his crippled Messerschmitt spiraled into the fields below, exploding in fire and steel. The descent was both endless and instant. Air whipped his face, ears roaring with the rush. He glimpsed the patchwork of French countryside, fields scarred with trenches, villages half ruined, roads lined with hedgerows. Farmers in the distance shielded their eyes, watching him drift down like a broken bird. He hit hard. His ankle twisted on impact, pain searing up his leg. He collapsed among stalks of wheat flattened by debris. For a moment he lay gasping, hands gripping earth, thankful only that he still breathed. Then the voices came. French villagers, their shouts sharp, urgent. Men hurried toward him, some clutching sticks or stones. A woman clutched a child to her chest, her face pale. Kurt staggered to his feet, hands raised. He tried to shout, "Nicht schießen! Don't shoot!" but his words fell useless in the wrong tongue. Before the villagers could reach him, another sound tore the air. Engines, low, steady, mechanical. He turned his head and froze. American jeeps and trucks rolled down the road, their hoods marked with the white star of the U.S. Army. Dust rose in their wake, sunlight glinting off helmets. The villagers scattered like birds, vanishing into hedgerows. Kurt's heart slammed. He dropped to his knees. This was it. The moment every German soldier dreaded. Capture. Propaganda posters had promised what awaited: humiliation, starvation, torture. The Americans were painted as monsters. "They will not treat you as men," his commander had warned. "Better to die in the sky than fall into their hands." But he had no pistol now, no cyanide pill tucked into his boot. Only pain in his ankle and terror in his chest. Boots thudded against dirt as soldiers closed in, rifles raised. Shouts in English rang around him. One barked an order. Another shoved him flat, rough hands stripping his sidearm and knife. Kurt clenched his eyes shut, bracing for the rifle butt, for the first blow that would mark the beginning of whatever horror came next. But the strike never landed. Instead, one soldier crouched near his ankle, eyes narrowing. He shouted something toward the trucks. Kurt caught one word through the tangle of English. Medic! His eyes snapped open. Surely he had misheard. A medic? For him? For the enemy? Another parachute drifted down in the distance, caught in a hedgerow. Gunfire cracked. Soldiers sprinted that way. Moments later, more Germans were dragged in. One limping, another pale with blood soaking his sleeve, a third unconscious, his face ashen. Kurt expected mockery, expected the wounded to be left to die. Instead, an American knelt by the bleeding man, pressing cloth to his wound. He spoke in quick, soothing tones, his hands practiced, efficient. The groan that rose from the German pilot softened into a whimper, not of death but of pain being tended. Kurt's breath caught. This was not brutality. This was care. Minutes later, a green-painted vehicle rolled up, its sides marked with red crosses. The rear doors swung open, revealing stretchers, blankets, bandages, an ambulance. Kurt stared as the wounded were lifted carefully inside. Not dragged, not thrown, carried. He shook his head in disbelief. This had to be some elaborate cruelty, some mockery before the real punishment. Then hands gestured toward his ankle. The soldier pointed at the ambulance. No, Kurt rasped in German. Gefängnis, prison. The soldier didn't understand. Or maybe he did, and he shook his head. Two Americans hoisted Kurt up, half carrying him toward the vehicle. He resisted weakly, but the pain in his leg left him powerless. They eased him inside onto a bench, settling him among his comrades. The doors shut. The engine rumbled. Inside smelled of antiseptic, sweat and blood. A medic checked the unconscious pilot's pulse, then tightened a bandage. Another dabbed at Kurt's ankle, binding it with cloth. Their movements were quick, but not cruel. Kurt sat rigid, heart pounding. Every instinct screamed that this was a trick, that the kindness was only surface. Yet the medic's hands were steady, his face focused. He glanced at Kurt once, eyes tired, not hateful. The ambulance jolted forward, carrying them away from the wreckage. For the first time since his chute had opened, Kurt let himself breathe. And in the corner of his mind, a single thought burned. If this is capture, then everything I have been told about war is a lie. The ride to the hospital rattled Kurt Weber's bones. The ambulance groaned over broken roads, suspension squealing as it bounced through craters left by bombs. Every jolt sent pain up his twisted ankle. Around him, his fellow airmen shifted and groaned. One clutched his arm where blood seeped steadily through cloth. Another lay motionless, his breaths shallow, his skin grey. The medic across from Kurt worked without pause. He pressed gauze to wounds, checked pulses, tightened straps on splints. He muttered in English under his breath, words Kurt couldn't follow but recognized from tone: reassurance, steadiness, focus, not cruelty, not mockery. Kurt's mind spun. Propaganda posters flashed in memory, grotesque caricatures of Americans with claws for hands, fangs for teeth. They had been painted as merciless creatures, yet here sat a medic, frowning in concentration, trying to keep German pilots alive. The vehicle slowed, doors banged open, shouts filled the air. Kurt was helped down, his arm slung over a soldier's shoulder. He expected to see barbed wire, guard towers, prison cells. Instead, canvas tents stretched across a field, their white flaps marked with red crosses. The smell of antiseptic hung heavy, mixed with mud and smoke. An American officer barked orders. Stretchers carried the wounded inside. Kurt limped behind, ushered by two guards. Inside the main tent, chaos reigned. Nurses in white aprons hurried between rows of cots. Doctors bent over patients, hands slick with blood, instruments gleaming under lantern light. And not all the patients wore Allied uniforms. Kurt blinked. On one cot lay a German infantryman, his chest bandaged. On another, a Luftwaffe pilot like himself, his arm strapped to a frame. The sight disoriented him. This was not prison. It was a hospital. A nurse guided Kurt to a cot. She spoke quickly in English, her hands gesturing for him to sit. He obeyed, heart thudding. She knelt, cutting away his boot with practiced efficiency. The pain made him hiss, but she only gave a sympathetic glance, not cruelty. She probed the ankle gently, then shouted for supplies. A bandage was wrapped tight, a cold compress pressed down. Kurt stared at her face, pale in the lantern light, eyes focused, lips set in determination. She did not see him as an enemy. She saw him as a patient. Nearby, another German pilot moaned. His sleeve was soaked crimson. A doctor bent over him, muttering to a nurse. "Prep for surgery," he ordered. The words cut through the haze of English. Surgery, for an enemy. Kurt's stomach twisted. He watched in disbelief as the man was wheeled toward a smaller tent where a surgical lamp glared. The hours blurred. Nurses passed, carrying trays, changing bandages. The groans of wounded men filled the air, German and American alike. Once a young US soldier cried out for his mother, and Kurt felt a pang in his chest. The sound was the same in any language. Night fell. Lanterns cast long shadows. The field hospital quieted slightly, though the hum of activity never stopped. Kurt lay awake, staring at the canvas ceiling. His ankle throbbed, but it was the weight in his mind that kept him restless. Why mercy? Why care for the enemy? What purpose did it serve? Interrogation, yes. Prison camps, of course. But hospitals, surgeries, blankets. He thought of home, his mother in Hamburg, rationing scraps of bread. His younger sister, whose last letter spoke of air raids and sleepless nights. Would she believe him if he wrote, "The Americans treated me like a patient, not a prisoner"? No. She would think it propaganda, just as he once had. The flap of the tent rustled. An American doctor entered, tall, thin, glasses perched on his nose. He moved from cot to cot, checking charts. When he reached Kurt, he crouched, examining the bandaged ankle. He pressed gently, making Kurt flinch. Then he nodded, scribbled something, and patted Kurt's shoulder lightly. It was such a small gesture, yet it shook Kurt more than gunfire ever had. "You fix me?" Kurt asked haltingly in English. The doctor looked at him for a moment, then replied simply, "Yes, fix." The word echoed in Kurt's mind long after the doctor moved on. Fix. Not break. Not punish. Fix. Hours of conflict. The following day, the Germans gathered strength. Some were moved onto cots near Kurt. Hans, a pilot from Munich, muttered bitterly, "They want us alive for show, to parade us, to make us confess." His eyes darted toward the nurses. "This kindness is a mask." But Otto, another airman with a stitched gash across his brow, shook his head. "A mask does not sew wounds. A mask does not bleed its own rations into soup." He held up a piece of bread, still warm. "They feed us better than our own commanders did." The debate lingered through the day. Some clung to suspicion, others to reluctant gratitude. But all agreed on one thing. Nothing matched the stories they had been told. Kurt listened, silent. Inside him, two voices battled. One whispered of propaganda, warning of traps. The other whispered of the doctor's pat on his shoulder, of the nurse's steady hands. Which voice was true? The surgery. That night, one of the youngest German pilots, barely 19, began coughing blood. His face turned ashen. Nurses rushed him toward the surgical tent. Kurt forced himself upright, watching through the gap in the canvas. Inside, the young man was laid on a table beneath a bright lamp. Doctors worked swiftly, cutting away fabric, clamping vessels. An anesthetic mask was pressed to his face. American nurses moved with practiced rhythm, handing instruments, wiping sweat. Kurt gripped his blanket. His stomach churned. This was an enemy boy, a Luftwaffe pilot who had once flown to kill these very men. Yet here they were, cutting into his chest not to end him, but to save him. Hours passed. Finally, the boy was wheeled back out, unconscious but breathing steadily, his chest bandaged. A nurse smiled faintly at the sight. Kurt exhaled shakily. The room seemed to tilt around him. If mercy could exist here, what did that mean for everything he had believed? A debt of life. Days turned into weeks. Kurt's ankle healed slowly under care. Bandages were changed, compresses applied. He learned fragments of English from overhearing nurses. Pain. Better. Rest. In return, he muttered German words softly, pointing, teaching curious nurses how to say Wasser for water, Brot for bread. The exchange felt surreal. One morning, the doctor with glasses returned. He checked Kurt's ankle, then tapped his notebook. "Good," he said. "You walk soon." Kurt nodded, unsure how to respond. Then he spoke quietly in broken English. "You saved me. Danke." The doctor paused, eyes meeting his. He gave a small smile, then moved on. Kurt sank back, heart heavy. Gratitude toward the enemy felt like betrayal. Yet denial was impossible. His life, quite literally, rested in American hands. That night, as the women in the Japanese camp had sung songs of home, so too did the German pilots murmur fragments of memory. Not songs, but stories. Hans spoke of his fiancée waiting it, and Munich. Otto described fishing with his father on the Rhine. Even Kurt whispered of his sister's laughter. The Americans didn't silence them. They let the stories rise, blending with the groans and murmurs of Allied wounded around them. The hospital was not a prison. It was something stranger, a place where enemies lay side by side, breathing the same air, surviving under the same lamps. Kurt closed his eyes. For the first time since the sky had swallowed his Messerschmitt, he felt not fear but confusion. And perhaps something more dangerous. Hope. The weeks in the American field hospital blurred together, a cycle of bandage changes, meals, and the steady hum of doctors' voices. The German pilots who had arrived broken and bleeding now found themselves stronger. Wounds closed, fevers lifted. Kurt's ankle, once swollen and useless, began to bear weight again. Nurses urged him to try walking, supporting him with patient hands. Yet even as their bodies healed, their minds twisted with disquiet. Gratitude festered like a wound they couldn't lance. Each kindness cut deeper than cruelty might have, because it eroded certainty. They had been told to expect monsters. Instead, they met medics. One morning, orders came. Trucks rumbled outside, dust swirling in their wake. Guards entered with gestures. Time to move. The pilots exchanged wary glances. Was this the moment mercy ended? The moment the mask fell? But no fists, no rifle butts, no jeers greeted them. Instead, they were escorted into the back of trucks and driven toward the interior. After hours on rough roads, fences and barracks appeared, a POW camp. Barbed wire crowned the fences. Watchtowers stood like sentinels. Yet within, order reigned. Germans milled about, some playing cards, others working in gardens. The smell of bread carried faintly from a kitchen. The pilots were processed swiftly, their names taken, their uniforms exchanged for simple work clothes. Guards searched them but did not strike. They were shown to bunks, given blankets. Kurt sat, heavily on his cot, staring at the wooden beams above. It was not freedom, but it was not the dungeon of his fears either. He turned to Otto, who lay across from him. "It feels strange," Kurt muttered in German. Otto nodded. "To be treated like men, not animals. Ja. Strange. Letters home. Weeks later, Red Cross representatives visited. Paper and pencils were distributed. The prisoners were told they could write letters, censored for content but still delivered." Kurt hesitated, pencil trembling in his hand. What could he write? The truth? That American doctors had saved them? That nurses had cleaned their wounds with gentleness? That he had been given bread warm from an enemy oven? Would his mother believe such words? Or would she think him broken, corrupted? At last he wrote simply, "I am alive. I was wounded but treated. Do not despair." Around him, others wrestled with the same struggle. Some wrote only fragments, names, dates, reassurances. Others dared to hint at the truth. We are not mistreated, we are fed, but none could capture the full weight of what they had seen. The letters were collected, sealed, carried away. The camp buzzed with whispers afterward. What would their families think when such words arrived? Mercy's burden, life in the camp settled into routine. Work details, roll calls, meals of bread, soup, and sometimes meat. It was not luxury, but it was survival. Some Americans even organized classes, teaching English or mathematics to pass the time. Others set up makeshift soccer fields, handing prisoners balls. For many Germans, this hospitality bred unease. To be fed by the enemy, clothed by the enemy, taught by the enemy, it blurred lines. Hans muttered often, "This is not kindness, this is strategy. They want to make us soft." Yet at night, when silence fell, Kurt remembered the hospital. He remembered the doctor's glasses glinting under the lamp, the nurse's steady hands, the words spoken in halting English. Fix. No strategy could explain the precision of a surgeon sewing veins, or the care of a medic pressing cloth against bleeding. That had been no performance. That had been life saved. One evening, Kurt whispered to Otto, "I owe them my leg, perhaps even my life. Tell me, is that not debt?" Otto stared at the ceiling. "A debt we can never repay. And perhaps that is why it hurts more than chains." War's end. Months passed. Winter arrived, cold winds sweeping through the barracks. Rumors swirled of Germany collapsing, of cities flattened, of surrender near. The prisoners huddled around stoves, listening for scraps of news from guards or Red Cross visitors. Then, one morning in May 1945, the announcement came. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The camp erupted in shouts, some of relief, others of grief. Men wept openly, thinking of homes lost, families scattered. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process the end. For Kurt, the words carried weight like stones. Surrender. The Reich that had promised glory lay in ruins. And yet, here he was, alive, fed, healed by enemy hands. The contradiction tore at him. Release. It took months more before release came. One by one, prisoners were processed, loaded onto trains, sent back across a continent in ruins. When Kurt finally stepped off in Hamburg, the city he knew was gone. Buildings lay gutted, streets reduced to rubble. His mother stood in the ruins of their old street, thinner, frailer, but alive. His sister clutched her skirt, her eyes wide. They embraced fiercely, tears mingling with dust. Words tumbled out, questions, relief, grief. But when Kurt tried to tell them of his captivity, of the hospital, of the mercy shown, their faces clouded. "They treated you well?" his mother asked, disbelief sharp. Kurt nodded slowly. "They saved us, doctors, nurses, they—" His sister shook her head. "No, They are Americans. They killed father in the raids. They destroyed this city. Kurt fell silent. He could not reconcile the two truths, bombs that killed and hands that healed. Legacy, years passed. Kurt built a life in the ashes, married, raised children. He spoke little of the war, but in private he wrote in notebooks recounting what he had seen. He wrote of the ambulance ride, of the doctor who said fix, of the boy whose chest had been opened and sewn shut by American hands. He wrote not to glorify the enemy, but to preserve the memory of mercy, a memory so heavy it could not be carried in silence. Other pilots did the same. Some shared stories in whispers at reunions. Others remained quiet, ashamed to admit they had lived because of kindness. For many, the hardest truth was not cruelty, but its absence. Mercy had unsettled them more deeply than any interrogation. It forced them to question propaganda, to question their own beliefs, to question war itself. And so, when asked in later years what haunted him most, Kurt never spoke of the dogfights, the crashes, the prison fences. He spoke of a tent filled with light, of hands that healed, of a word spoken in broken English.